Welcome to today's program from the Greensboro History Museum. My name is Glenn Perkins, and I am the Curator of Community History here at the museum. Tomorrow, May 18th, is International Museum Day, a date that the ICOM, International Council on Museums, designates every year to kind of explore what museums do around the world. This year, the big theme they're talking about is the power of museums, and sort of we're thrilled to have a local connection today that provides a great example of what the power of museums can be across borders and across time. So we're thrilled to have our friend, Dr. Ann Parsons from UNC Greensboro here. Hi, Ann.
Hello.
To talk about the most recent cohort project for the UNCG Public History and Museum Studies, focusing on Tuchyn, Ukraine and the Jewish uprising in 1942. And joining me today is my colleague, Sarah Ann Mask, our education associate and program coordinator here at the Greensboro History Museum, and you're a fairly recent graduate of the UNCG Public History Department and has worked closely with Ann on a number of projects. So it's great to be able to come together and talk about this important research and to hear some of the stories and discoveries that y'all have made in doing this. So let's get started. Oh, well, let me say one more little bit of housekeeping. For those of you in the audience, you're free to drop some questions into the Q&A or the chat. We will kind of just be having a conversation today, going back and forth. So we will work in any questions you have to talk about that. If you're on Facebook, we're going to try to keep a little eye on the Facebook Q&A as well to see if there's anything that we can ask Dr. Parsons about the project as we go along. So let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to you, Sarah.
Okay, great. Hi, Dr. Parsons. Tell us a little bit about what the 1942 Tuchyn Uprising is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. First, before I begin, I'll just thank you both for having me today, and just want to echo what Glenn said, which is if people have questions, small or big, pop them in the chat. The project we worked on is called Roots of Resistance, the Tuchyn Story. Tuchyn is a town, now it's 3,000, it had been about 6,000 in western part of Ukraine, near Rivne, formerly Rovno. And during the Holocaust in Ukraine, one thing that a lot of people don't know is in that part of Eastern Europe, the Nazis had come in and waged what's called a Holocaust by bullets. About 1.5 million Jews died in that region of what is now Ukraine. It wasn't at the time, but that area that's now Ukraine. And much of the killing that happened in that part of the world was from the German soldiers and Nazis digging graves outside, mass graves outside of towns, villages, cities, and having mass executions in that area. So Tuchyn in 1942 had been occupied by the Germans during World War II. And in September of 1942, on Yom Kippur, which was the holiest day of the Jewish New Year, the Jews in the town of Tuchyn learned that the Germans had come and started digging mass graves outside. And the Jewish community had already heard about these mass killings that were happening in other places, such as Baba Yar, which had happened in Kyiv the year before. And they began to organize a resistance against the Germans for when the Germans came to gather them and liquidate the ghetto. So they smuggled in kerosene and maybe about a dozen weapons or so. And when they saw the Germans coming to liquidate the ghetto, they kind of shouted the sign or the signal that the Jews should set fire to their homes and to the buildings, and create a diversion. And then the men fought back in 4 different units. Ultimately, for the fighters, it was very much a suicide mission, and almost all of the people who fought were killed killed within a day or 2. But many, there were about 2,000 Jews, many women, children, people who were elderly, who fled to the forests, and they were able to escape. Over the next few weeks, many people couldn't survive in the forests. The Nazis actually and Germans had posted signs saying, "Come back and we won't harm you." So many people did come back. And when they came back, there were mass executions of them, even against what they had said. So ultimately, I think there were about maybe 2,600 Jews, it's estimated, who were in Tuchyn in September 1942, and ultimately only about 69 people survived. For us, the story that we're really telling is one of resistance, both that armed resistance of Jews fighting back, but also resistance in preserving people's dignity and saving other people, in non-Jewish Ukrainians saving Jews and Jews saving other Jews, small and large. That concept of resistance is really what we've been working to teach people here in North Carolina and in the States.
Yeah, I think that story of, and the resistance of maintaining that history and sort of keeping it alive against maybe the push for it to get lost, I think is something that's fascinating to me. I'm curious sort of how you found out about the story and sort of what drew you to it as a potential piece of history to explore with the students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I am a trained US historian, not a European historian. So it's a good question how I came about this. And for me, I actually one of the things is powerful, and I particularly appreciate doing this on International Museums Day, is what really prompted me to work on the project was a very long trip at a museum. At the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I was there in DC. I had been there multiple times. And I went with a friend who's the type who reads every single panel. Do you know these people? And so so they were super slow. And so I had extra time in the museum. And at one place in the Holocaust Museum, they have a wall. And on the wall are etched the names with thousands of names of communities that were destroyed during the Holocaust. And I looked at this huge wall, and I had Jewish great-grandparents, and I didn't know where they had come from. My great-grandparents had immigrated here around 1900. So they came to the United States well before World War II, but they were alive during World War II. They had actually left family over in Europe, and I couldn't say anything about where they were from. So I sat there in that museum, and I ended up going into the Family Research Center, which they also have at the museum, and I began doing research over the next few years on where they came from. And I learned that one of the places they came from was Tuchyn. One snippet, like it was a tiny shard that I had heard in my family, was that at some point the Jews and family members were killed in a fire in a synagogue. That was like it was a shard that I had heard. And when I learned about the name Tuchyn, and that was where my mother's grandparents were from, I found this book about it, and there on the front of the book was a picture of a fire. You know what I mean? This and Jews running away. And I learned in that moment that the Jews had themselves set the fire. Like I learned in learning about Tuchyn and its story, it was the Jews that had set the fire. The way I had always heard it was that, perhaps like the Nazis had gathered people in and set fire to it, like a really story of victimization, if that makes sense. And instead, I learned that the Jews had, in fact, done this resistance themselves with fire. And this story of Tuchyn became very different, one of resistance and not victimization. And so that really hooked me in, that I wanted to not just study the history of my family, but the history of this place and what happened there.
How has your project kind of evolved? Like, what's the final product, and how have you gotten your students involved in the story and this research that you've kind of went on this journey with?
Yeah. To give a little bit of a behind the scenes of the working life of a public historian, when we come across a research topic, or a research project, the next question is, okay, what do we do with it? Do you know what I mean? I found this story. There was very little written about it, not much done. So what do we do? And the project, as of now, has three main elements. The first big element was that we were able to connect with Ukrainian scholars in Rivne near Tuchyn, who at the very same moment that I started working on this, they had discovered the story too. And they created a film about Tuchyn. And what we did was we were able to collaborate with them and share primary sources that we had found, share materials, share resources with them, and support that film. And so that was very important collaboration. The second thing we did here stateside, which they supported us in, is to create a traveling exhibit about Tuchyn that's both digital and physical. It's kind of this hybrid, using both physical installation and digital installation, and travel that to high schools here and community centers in North Carolina. And then the third piece, which really has become a question mark, is that we have been working to try to organize a commemoration event in Ukraine this coming September. This coming September is the 80th anniversary of the Tuchyn Uprising. And so we had been working with partners in Ukraine and Israel, throughout the United States, other parts of Europe, to organize a commemoration event there in Tuchyn. And now it's this big question mark. So those are the three main projects we're working on. In terms of students, for me, what's been so exciting is we have a Master's in History of Museum Studies program at UNCG. And we have been able to bring students into the project in a way that they're able to learn a lot more about international public history work. So how do you tell the history of events that happen far away, in different languages, different cultures, and learn that international history. So what we did was we had students involved, graduate students over the course of a year and a half, involved in the planning of the traveling exhibit part. And very specifically, they helped curate and curated the digital part of the exhibit, which I'll pop in the link, pop a link in the chat in a minute. I also have some slides I can show at some point about the digital exhibit, that kind of thing. But the students were very much involved in planning the exhibit, what it would be like, and then curating it.
Yeah, let's take a look actually at some of the images that you shared with us, and you can kind of walk us through a couple of the components so we can get real familiar with, what the pieces and what this exhibit, and not just the exhibit, but sort of your experience in working on the exhibit has looked like.
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'll start with, this is the landing page of the website. And so the website is exhibit, I'll pop it in right now, exhibit.rootsresist.com. We're still in the final editing of it, so you'll see we're launching it this coming fall, but you can take a look now, a sneak peek. So the very first piece is that this is a digital and physical hybrid exhibit. Why? So I started this project in January 2020, and it was like, all right, we're going to make a physical exhibit. That's what I'm used to. Let's go. And then 2 months later, the pandemic happened, and it was like, that does not seem like the strongest bet anymore, to just do something that's only physical. So we decided to do something that, had a really strong digital component. So what I'm about to show are some of the slides of the digital exhibit. And the digital exhibit is really where we tell the story of what happened. And in our physical exhibit, that part has interactive experiences that we curated particularly for high school students, to really engage with the history, to process it, to use the arts and humanities to have a more interactive experience. So first we'll start with the digital and then we'll see that, but the digital exhibit is really where we tell the story. This is the landing page of the exhibit, and in the background is a painting by Josef Zilberberg, who is one of the 3 remaining survivors of Tuchyn. He was 9 when it occurred, and he was hidden by a Ukrainian family with his family in a hole under a I think it was like a shed for over a year. They were hidden and then finally were able to come out when the Russians liberated the area. So Josef's paintings really make up a large part of the exhibit. Without them, we would not have ways to bring Tuchyn to life. If you want to click to the next slide, we tell the history of the exhibit through the story of 3 people. Luba Chomit, who now lives in the United States, Josef Zilberberg, who is in Israel, and Manya Schwartzman, who's passed away, but her son now lives in France and has worked with us. You can see through at the bottom that the exhibit breaks up into with the introduction and the conclusion. But then we have a section on occupation, the German occupation of the area, a section on resistance, which is a video about the armed resistance and other forms of resistance. And then finally, the aftermath, what happened to these individuals and also what happened to the community. If you click to the next slide. In the next slide, it shows the occupation section. We decided to teach students and community members about this history through a story map. And so what people do is they click on different parts of the map and they learn about Tuchyn and the anti-Semitic policies of the Germans during German occupation by learning about the location of the ghetto, of the synagogue and burning of Torah scrolls there, that type of thing. We will come back to this in a minute and have Sarah talk more about it. But for right now, I'll take us quickly through the other features of it. If you click to the next one. In the resistance section, we curated a 5-minute video. We found that many high school students, which was our primary audience, really learn through video these days. And so we curated a video that teaches that way, and we were able to incorporate some of the film that our Ukrainian partners used. So on the screen are 6 reenactors in Rivne, Ukraine. They had actually in 2021 reenacted the Tuchyn Uprising and did a film about it, and they were able to share that with us. So that is a big component that we now share with our students. And if you click through to the next section, then the final section is we really talk about the aftermath of the ways things are remembered. And so on the screen now is a photograph of the Tuchyn Memorial. There's one small memorial plaque that reads at the bottom, in memory of 3,000 Jews, residents of Tuchyn, who raised the banner of revolt in the Tuchyn ghetto, murdered, burned, and buried alive by murderers in September 1942 in honor of their sacred memory. And it's also in Hebrew and Ukrainian above. So that sits in Tuchyn right now. That was where we were also hoping to have the commemoration. Maybe before we actually talk about the physical exhibit, maybe Sarah, if you'd like to go back some and just talk briefly about the story map, as Sarah herself was involved in helping make it. If you want to talk some about this.
So before I started this job here at Greensboro History Museum, I worked over the summer with Dr. Parsons to really look for the sites. It was shocking to see how much is missing from Tuchyn. When you get there and you start looking at the sites, there's any remnants of the Jewish community has pretty much disappeared. And without the memorial, they probably wouldn't know any of it happened there. And so there was it a professor in Ukraine, or one of the professors had went over and took lots of photographs of certain sites, and had a graduate student do screenshots of a Ukrainian version, kind of like Google Earth. And so I went through and tried to look for those sites. And these are a few of the ones that I did find. And then Dr. Parsons went and made it what it is today.
Glenn, as you're looking at all of this, are there any questions that you have, or any other folks, just about the digital piece of it? Or
yeah, I'm curious too, and this kind of leads into, sort of something I wanted to talk about in the international exchange components of this whole effort. Sarah was talking about the ways of using the materials that the scholars in Ukraine had created. What were some of the both joys and challenges that you found of working with such a widespread community to tell this story?
Well, if anyone has met me, they'll know that I love to talk about the joys first, as I try to be a happy person generally. So one of the greatest joys, and it's one of the reasons I'd encourage people to explore history outside our boundaries, outside of our country. I am such a believer in local history and such a believer in knowing the history of where you live. And also I've learned a lot from studying other places. So for me, one of the huge joys was to connect with scholars in Ukraine. And I just popped a link in the chat to the organization Mnemonics, and this is their website. There's if you comes up in Ukrainian, you can choose English at the top to read it in English. And it was just an incredible joy to get interested in this project, start researching it, and then to be introduced to people who themselves were working on it across an ocean. And they had such different research questions. One thing that's very notable was that one of their biggest research questions was around armed resistance. And you can see how they themselves live in Ukraine, and at that time had the constant threat of Russian invasion looming over them. And so armed resistance was incredibly important. And so that really was a central research question for them as they worked on it. Their film was very much about the armed resistance in a way that we were kind of open to many different types of resistance issue, kind of different topics, but for them, armed resistance. So it was just so interesting to connect with people who had very different perspectives, but that we also shared a lot of similarities, just belief that it was important to study this history, that this history, many of the mass graves, for instance, are completely unmarked, and to think about ways to mark them, to honor it, to, not just let this history go fallow. So that was really a joy for me. One of the biggest challenges has been language. Only a minority of the sources are in English. So there are many sources that are in German archives that are in German, or in Ukrainian or Russian archives in Russian or Ukrainian. But one of the biggest types of sources have been survivors' testimonies, which the vast majority of them have been in Hebrew. And so for me, over the last few years, I've been working with translators, also friends such as Dr. Jones in our history department has been graciously enough doing some Russian translation for me. But then I myself have been literally learning Hebrew so that I can read read the survivors' testimonies. And so just that language barrier has been the biggest barrier. And at the same time, it's a bridge because it forces me to ask for help as a public historian. Sometimes as a historian or a researcher, you just work in your own bubble. But when you're working on something and you don't know the language, it forces you to reach out and say, hey, can you help me with this? In the case of working with mnemonics, they didn't have access to they don't know Hebrew either. So they didn't have access to the survivors' testimonies. So we were getting them translated into English and then sharing them with them. They knew English. They were then using it. And so it was language was both a barrier, but it also was a connection between us. It forced us all to work together. So it's been pretty incredible that way.
That's fascinating. I love that, that sort of that challenge becomes an opportunity when you're trying to cross this border, that you are, like you said, you're forced to ask for help. You're forced to find, a way over that kind of resistance, to really work together. And I think, how has this, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year must have complicated things. I mean, how have you been able to stay in touch with your colleagues over in Ukraine?
Yeah, the invasion has been devastating, obviously for the people in Ukraine and also for the people in mnemonics. So one of the principal members of mnemonics is now in Czech Republic, where she's working and is effectively displaced. And then another principal member is mobilized and is fighting. And so it really, it's been devastating to see how this has just completely disrupted their lives and threatened, literally taken the lives of so many people. The one thing we have been in touch, and one thing that's been really inspiring has been Natalia Ivchik, who's one of the main scholars in mnemonics, has really been committed to continuing this work, to continuing the work of documenting and sharing the history of trauma and violence in this region. And so they're both continuing, or Natalia is continuing to do work around the history of the Holocaust, but then also mnemonics has started an effort to try to get oral histories of people who are displaced from the war. Where we are right now at UNC Greensboro, we have been able to finish the exhibit in these last couple of months. We're tying up loose ends and are going to launch it. And then my hope is that this summer we can reconvene both, virtually with our partners in Ukraine and also in other parts of the world, and try to think about where do we go from here? How do we support mnemonics as it goes forward? How do we, what do we work on? Because at this moment, on the one hand, an exhibit feels irrelevant, and at the same time, this history of violence and resistance in Ukraine feels more relevant than ever, right? So trying to really come together as a group and talk through what we would do. And that's a core museum practice and public history practice called sharing authority, where it's not just a historian deciding what do we do next, but really trying to bring other community partners into the conversation and try to then determine next steps.
I want to go a little further into looking at physical and the development of your exhibit itself. You're talking about this is violence. It's a difficult history to kind of wrap your head around. And what kind of challenges did you have in creating an exhibit and making a very physical exhibit that reflects on that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And actually, maybe if you're able to pull up the things, the trees, the graduate students were really interested in designing a physical installation that both encouraged students to engage with the history, but that also was, in a way, healing or at least honoring the trauma of the history, if that makes sense. And so the students really came up with the idea of having the motif of trees. Trees are so important in Ukrainian culture. And in fact, Tuchyn was surrounded by forests. That's where people escaped to. Trees also, or many of them are still standing today, even in the face of such violence. So in many ways, nature, the natural world, trees were a witness to that violence. And there's also a motif in Jewish culture of the tree of life, and that trees also have a way of signifying rebirth and regrowth through seeds, through new branches, through new life. So the students really used this motif of trees. And so we created, for right now, 3 trees. We might create more. This is our pilot exhibit, and each tree has a different activity. The one that's on the front, there are 3 trees right here, is a poetry activity in which students would take the words of survivors and put them into their own poetry. The second one, if you click one more over, Sarah, the second tree was postcards. So we worked with an artist who created small postcards. And on this postcard, it says, "To any person in the future, I encourage you to contribute to creating a culture in which all beings can be peaceful, safe, and free from suffering." And then the student there actually drew hands holding together. So students were then encouraged to do their own artistic or writing interpretation. So a second one was these postcards. And then the third tree had a movement activity where students could get up and physically embody resistance, liberation. So the idea was to have the physical installation be both about the history, but also about the feeling and processing of this hard history.
The activities, were those developed collaboratively among the students, sort of as you guys gathered the evidence and created the sort of the digital history components? What was the spark, I guess, to those more interactive elements? Because I think those are all very fascinating, as you mentioned, the ways of processing what you're learning in different ways.
Yeah, no, totally. What we did was, and it's one of the reasons I'm actually particularly excited to be on here too, is one of the things that I did is to reach across disciplines and connect with Adam Carlin, who's actually Victoria Milstein's son. I think all of you have had Victoria on. She's currently making a sculpture on the Holocaust and women, and her son is also an artist, had been at UNCG, is now in Syracuse. And so we brought Adam into it, and Adam does art as social practice, which is in many ways participatory art. You create artistic pieces in which people are engaging with them. And so it was in working with Adam, our curatorial team of graduate students and myself, and then Adam came up with the idea of having, inviting one artist per tree to come in and develop prompts and activities. And so we had one movement artist, one visual artist, and then finally, in my case, I partnered with a descendant, a family member of mine who's a descendant of some of my family who died in Tuchyn, who's in theater, and then also another family member who's a designer and also therapist, who developed the poetry prompt. And so in that way, it really became this collaborative effort of different artists bringing their own ideas to it. That said, we really are very much, we just took it to a high school classroom, Millbrook High School in Raleigh, and tested it out. We found out what they loved, hated, all that kind of stuff. And so now we're working on trying to improve each prompt to make it better.
Again, you're reaching out across the different borders to ask for help and to find those connections. I think that's, it seems to be one of the main motifs of this project a lot, and in ways that you're embodying this resistance as well. So let's see, can the you mentioned that it is for you're thinking of high school students in particular, and it's been to the one high school. Are there plans, or how are you seeking to kind of get it out to other places across the state or even beyond?
Yeah, that is a great question. I just dropped a link in the chat, which is to the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. It's a statewide agency or organization that does a huge amount around teacher education and community education around the Holocaust here in North Carolina. And it also has an traveling exhibits program. And all of their traveling exhibits right now are physical. So they traditionally have physical exhibits that are displayed largely in high schools, sometimes in other settings, community colleges, community centers, and they have a system. And so this is being provided to them for the traveling exhibit to actually travel within that North Carolina Council on the Holocaust Traveling Exhibits program. So we're starting to get the word out right now to find schools that are interested in signing up, and we're going to launch it next year. We're hoping to launch it first in Greensboro. So stay tuned on where we will launch it. And then from there, travel it hopefully for the next 5 or 10 years through the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust Traveling Exhibits program.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What do you hope this project, what is that impact that you hope it will have on, I know, North Carolina education, but I know you've talked a little bit with me before about taking it to Ukraine and to the Tuchyn community?
Yeah, there are two answers to the question. The first is the impact we hope to have both here, but also in many other places, has been on really promoting tolerance and really getting students thinking hard about how violence develops against other people and how people can resist that in small ways, in large ways, in empowering students to stand up to violence, emotional violence, physical violence as they see it in their communities. And so that's been really important to us as a team. Our hope is that we're able to translate the exhibit and take it to Ukraine. And so prior to the invasion, we had actually learned that there's a high school there in Tuchyn. It actually had been used as the former German headquarters. It's now the school there. And many of the students had just learned about this uprising last year through working with mnemonics, and they were very much interested in the exhibit and the commemoration. And so it's truly our hope that there will be a cessation to the war and that we're able to take this there to Tuchyn to teach students about it. It's one of the reasons it really is important to have it accessible digitally. So we're able to translate it into Ukrainian so that people there can access this history. And that really is important to us as well.
I feel like this, everything you've mentioned about the impact really is a testimony to, you know, this idea, not just of the power of museums that International Museum Day is about this year, but the power of museum practices in the way that we can dig into, in this case, the past, and find ways to share it and get people to engage with it, to share that authority, like you were talking about, with its meaning, but also, you know, to find ways to heal and move forward. And it's really a powerful project. And so I'm so glad you came today to talk to us about it. I haven't had any specific questions from other folks. Is there anything that you want to share or tell us about the project?
Yeah,
Or
no,
ask
just
us about?
yeah, no, thank you for having me today. I so appreciate it. And we appreciate talking about it. And for folks out there, just stay tuned for learning about the Greensboro launch and later in 2022.
That'll be fantastic. We will look forward to sharing that information out through here at the History Museum. Again, it's been wonderful having you, Anne, to talk about this, and my gratitude to you for spending our time with us, and to your students and all your collaborators on this project, and Sarah for joining in on our conversation and for your contributions to it as well. We're going to make this program available tomorrow on the official International Museum Day, also Jewish American Heritage Month, all May. So we'll you know, it's another great opportunity to talk about this and how these kind of broader stories of Jewish history tie into local ones as well. So thanks everyone for being here, and have a wonderful afternoon.